We're over a year into the new console generation, and most of the games that have been released haven't taken full advantage of the new hardware. Most titles are still firmly in cross-gen territory, with broad overlap between last and current-gen versions. Further complicating the generational split, we've seen some hardware differentiation on the Microsoft side. Decreasing gains in manufacturing efficiency have led Microsoft to debut two consoles immediately this generation, including the lower power and lower cost Xbox Series S. So perhaps that leaves the venerable Xbox One X in a good position. It has significantly more raw GPU power than a Series S, and more bandwidth as well, although the CPU is much more primitive. Storage performance lags far behind, but perhaps this can be solved with an upgrade to a high bandwidth SSD. This used to be a prohibitively pricey proposition, but the cost of an SSD has dropped significantly, and it's easily the most potent upgrade you can make to a last-gen machine. So how does this upgraded Xbox One X stack up to a Series S? Can Microsoft's vintage 2017 tech match, or even beat, a current-gen console? It's a controversial comparison because fundamentally Series X is the One X successor, while Series S replaces the One S. The clue's in the name. However, Series X availability is scarce, and Series S is relatively commonplace. It's also worth remembering that Xbox One X was always targeted at the core gamer, while Series S is much more of a mainstream proposition. Regardless, some of the comparisons are fascinating and may well remain so, until the cross-gen era is finally over. The Xbox One X was an extremely impressive piece of kit when it debuted in late 2017. It delivered existing games at resolutions approaching or even reaching a full 4K, with a surprisingly ambitious 6 teraflop GPU. For the last-gen gamer, this was the ultimate console. Reading the spec sheet against the Series S, it certainly seems like the One X should be able to keep pace, at least from a graphical perspective. The GPU in the One X is faster on paper, though it lacks hardware support for modern graphical features like ray tracing. Plus, it has access to more memory and has a substantially higher level of memory throughput. The CPU, unfortunately, is much weaker, with a feeble architecture originally intended for tablets and a lower clock speed as well. This may not matter as much as you'd think, however, as cross-gen titles are being designed around the even weaker CPUs in the other last-gen machines. Without a more capable processor, however, One X is going to remain firmly in 30 FPS territory in most modern games. No amount of settings tweaks can overcome the hard CPU limit, so additional GPU horsepower is best spent hitting high resolutions. Storage also poses an issue for the X, with a relatively slow 5400 RPM hard drive at its core. But conveniently, we can push past the base hardware here with an upgrade to an SSD. So we've enhanced the One X, upgrading the system with a 1TB Samsung T7 external SSD. We're limited to USB 3.0 speeds here, but we should be getting up to 4 times the sequential load speeds of the internal drive, along with an exponential improvement in random transfers. This should mean that games load much more quickly, and that ambitious cross-gen titles exhibit fewer pop-in and stability issues in general play. So how do the Series S and our One X with SSD stack up in real-world use? First, we're going to take a look at a variety of recent titles, seeing how the hardware balance shakes out across a variety of prominent games. Next, we'll take a look at loading performance, with an eye towards how close an SSD-Enhanced One X can get to the relatively seamless experience offered by the Series S. Finally, we'll take a crack at a few last-gen only and Xbox 360 games to see how backwards compatible titles fare across both systems. Let's start with a bit of a controversial one. Guardians of the Galaxy is an impressive looking game, but the Series S version undoubtedly disappoints. We're getting a 1080p 30fps rendition of the game on S, a temporally stable but soft rendition of the superhero title. The Series X and PlayStation 5 versions have 60fps and ray tracing modes as of the latest patch, while the only option on Series S is to remove the framerate limiter. Removing the limit reveals a wildly unstable framerate that runs the gamut from 30 to 60 FPS, although owners of VRR displays may still find it useful. One X, on the other hand, turns in a rather attractive image that holds up great on a 4K display. Resolution here falls between 1440p and 1890p in general play, and still manages to hold a solid 30 FPS. Series S still has an edge in shadows and texture quality, but One X undoubtedly produces a better looking final result. So One X has the advantage then. Perhaps Forza Horizon 5, Microsoft's ambitious open world racer, will produce results more favorable to the Series S. Series S has two modes here. A 30 FPS quality mode targeting a dynamic 1440p, and a 60 FPS performance mode targeting a dynamic 1080p, both backed up by 4x multi-sample anti-aliasing. The quality mode has substantially more environmental detail, with overhauled models, improved ground detail, and less aggressive LODs. It's an impressive looking version of the game, though resolution isn't particularly high, and the title's lack of TAA produces a shimmery output in motion. One X's visual density isn't quite up to the level of the Series S quality mode, with environments that look more in line with those in the Series S performance mode, but there is a trade-off. One X targets a full 4K output with 4x MSAA at 30 FPS, with dynamic resolution scaling at play, but often producing a full 4K image. The One X is typically rendering around twice the pixels of the Series S, and it really shows. Comparing the One X to the Series S quality mode, it's a close enough final result that the victor really depends on what you want to prioritize. The One X is resolving more distant detail and has less shimmer, although the Series S is more attractive if you examine the environment up close and has less visible pop-in. Both systems turn in very stable frame rates at their respective performance targets. 60 FPS is not supported on One X at all, however, with no toggle for a high frame rate mode with lower settings like on Series S. Moving on to another Microsoft flagship title, we have Halo Infinite. There are 30 FPS and 60 FPS modes on both the Series S and the One X, and visual settings between the two systems on each mode are fairly similar, with some small cutbacks in the 60 FPS modes. But in terms of the actual image detail resolved, One X is a massive winner. Like with Guardians of the Galaxy, Series S is stuck at a maximum resolution of 1080p, with dynamic res even kicking in sometimes. The 1080p cap is present in both the quality and performance modes. In contrast, the One X comes in with a dynamic 1440p in performance mode and a dynamic 4K in quality mode. The increase in clarity is massive, particularly in the quality mode. The Series S tends to have a bit of a noisy, rough look, whereas the One X looks smooth and resolves far finer detail. The difference here is almost generational at times, although Microsoft's last-gen machine is actually coming out ahead. Performance, however, is a different story. Series S essentially locks to its framerate targets, although the 30 FPS mode does have frame pacing issues, and cutscenes exhibit odd-looking animation stutter. There's the occasional dropped frame or two, or momentary hitch during gameplay, but it's quite a good performer overall. Now, One X does generally lock to 30 FPS in quality mode, although you do see some frame pacing issues here as well. Most battles in performance mode, however, do tend to drop frame rate into the 50s at points, which is quite noticeable. I also saw some noticeable texture pop-in at close distances on the One X, even though I was running the game off an SSD. There's definitely a sense that it's not quite stable enough on the One X, although image quality is excellent. Still, if performance can be made just a bit smoother, perhaps through more aggressive dynamic resolution for instance, One X will be a clear winner over Series S. Ubisoft's Far Cry 6 is one of the more basic cross-gen conversions we've seen, with a 30 FPS versus 60 FPS split defining the generational divide. One X is 30 FPS, while Series S runs at 60 FPS. Both consoles do seem like solid performers though, with no framerate deviance in my testing. There's a basic low-quality blur on camera movement, but it doesn't do much to help the somewhat choppy feeling output on One X. This is certainly a title that benefits quite a lot from a 60 FPS update. The visual settings look very similar between the two versions. Predictably though, there's a massive difference in resolution. Series S tops out at about 1224p and looks very 1080p-like most of the time, while One X renders at 4K with dynamic resolution. Distant details like this sign resolve quite clearly on One X, while Series S is a bit of a blurry mess in comparison. Both versions feel stable and polished, although it would have been nice to see a 30 FPS option on Series S. At the moment, Far Cry 6 offers a stark choice between image quality and frame rate between One X and Series S. To get both, you'll have to step up to PS5 or Series X. Next up, two Call of Duty games, Vanguard and Warzone. Call of Duty Vanguard turns in rather impressive visuals on Series S, with a dynamic 1440p resolution backed up with the IW8 engine's accomplished TAA and temporal supersampling. One X seems to be turning in a very 4K-like presentation, although dynamic res is in effect here as well. You'll find a clearer image on One X, although that's not the full visual picture. That's because there are a range of visual downgrades on Microsoft's last-gen machine. Character self-shadowing is less refined in this scene. Some incidental details, like this rebel here, are cut out as well. The fog and atmospheric effects in this scene look a little bit less dense as well. None of these cuts feel especially massive on their own, but taken together they do make the One X version feel somewhat less refined. Series S is essentially a locked 60 FPS, with occasional one-off frame drops that are accompanied by tearing in the top fifth of the screen. One X mostly holds to 60 as well, with a few frame rate dips in general gameplay during more intense scenes. One X really struggles with cutscenes, however. These scripted scenes play back in 40 to 50 FPS territory much of the time, and when One X does drop frames, it exhibits tearing in the top fifth of the screen. Performance and graphics are both best on Series S, I feel, even though the raw resolution is lower. Finally, there's a 120Hz mode exclusive to Series S. Resolution takes a big dive here, with 1080p as the top-end resolution, although even this isn't enough to lock performance. We're often in sub 100 FPS territory here, with a less than ideal readout on conventional displays. This is a mode well suited for VRR, however. Call of Duty Warzone is a bit of an odd case. Here, resolution tops out at 1080p on Series S and a full 4K on One X, although with dynamic res on that console. Still, the final output image on One X is very crisp and 4K-like, whereas Series S is rather soft. Curiously, the Series S version here is actually running the base Xbox One code through Microsoft's backwards compatibility enhancement system, so it inherits the visual settings from that version. That means pulled in draw distances, reductions to foliage, and of course that 1080p resolution. Performance strongly favors the Series S, however. Series S is essentially a locked 60 frames per second, with no in-game drops in my testing. In contrast, One X is constantly dropping frames, typically hovering between 45 and 55 frames per second. And just like Vanguard, those dropped frames are accompanied by tearing in the top portion of the screen. Neither version of Warzone feels like a great way to play, unfortunately. The Series S version lacks enough clarity to consistently identify players at a distance, and the One X version just has quite poor performance. Series S would be my preference here, but not by much. Cyberpunk 2077 is a notoriously poor performer on last-gen consoles, but One X actually puts in a reasonable showing. Dynamic res is in effect here, with typical pixel counts around 1440p. Series S turns in a typical resolution of 1080p, although it can go up to 1440p at maximum. Actual visual settings, however, seem virtually identical between the two consoles. This scene, for instance, is extremely similar on both machines. The only real difference here, outside of a slight improvement in clarity on the One X, is an improvement to pedestrian density on Series S. This is randomized, of course, but there does seem to be a persistent advantage in favor of Series S in pedestrian density across the game. Both consoles target 30 FPS. The Series S offers a solid 30 FPS update here, with only rare dips in my testing. One X offers a similar level of consistency in most on-foot gameplay, with just the occasional dropped frame. Driving around the game world can send the frame rate tumbling into the low 20s, however, with a mix of over-budget frames and lengthy hitches. FPS dips on the One X seem to be accompanied by tearing in the top portion of the screen as well. We're likely hitting CPU limits on the X here, with the 2013-era Jaguar cores just not capable of processing the data streaming quickly enough. There are also some dips during firefights and in densely populated city areas. Cyberpunk 2077 is an ambitious and technically flawed game that seems to overpower the last-gen consoles, and the One X is no exception. It's a serviceable enough version of the game if you can forgive its occasional bouts of poor performance, but the Series S offers a much better experience. The last recent release we're analyzing here is Metro Exodus, and with good reason. This is the most interesting console split by far. First up, let's look at One X. Here, we get a sharp-looking 30 FPS first-person shooter, pushing a native 4K resolution. It's a highly detailed game, with excellent lighting and foliage. There's nothing too out of the ordinary here, but it's a handsome last-gen game that chugs along at a consistent 30 FPS. Series S is completely different. The new resolution target is 1080p, although internal resolution is often 720p or below in outdoor scenes. A solid implementation of temporal supersampling means that you do get a reasonably clean image here, despite that low internal resolution, although there's obvious breakup in motion and the image is very soft. Fortunately, 60 FPS is in the cards here, and it's a pretty solid 60 FPS with only occasional 1 or 2 frame drops. But that's only half the story. The game's artist-sculpted probe-based lighting system has been stripped out and replaced with a ray-traced global illumination system, or RTGI. This is the new version of the 4A engine designed with current-gen consoles in mind, and it can only run on consoles with hardware-accelerated ray tracing features. The lighting is much more realistic as a result, with beautifully balanced light that realistically fills each area. The improvement is most profound in indoor areas, which often look completely different as a result. I still feel One X may be the better looking game on the whole, owing to its massively improved base resolution. Series S has a more natural appearance, however, and it feels much smoother to play. Series X and PS5 get the best of both approaches, of course, but the pick here is going to come down to personal preference. The decision between the two consoles would be trickier if Series S were to support a 30 FPS quality mode, however, where resolution would be higher and you'd retain the RT effects. On cross-gen games, the score between the One X and the Series S is fairly even. In general, One X offers higher resolutions at lower performance levels, while Series S compromises somewhat on resolution to deliver higher frame rates and more graphical features in some titles. Each system has their own unequivocal wins, but they seem fairly evenly matched in these games overall. Let's move on to our next section, loading. On paper, our SSD-equipped One X should be able to bridge the gap between a last-gen console with a hard drive and the Series S with its super-fast NVMe SSD. So how close does it actually get? Here's our data. This is an average of 3 runs of an early game load in each of these titles. First, Call of Duty Vanguard. The One X with SSD splits the difference here with a relatively brief 11.8 second load. It's far short of the near instant Series S, but it's a big improvement over the stock hardware. Forza Horizon 5 is a little more troublesome on last-gen hardware, but the One X with SSD shows another substantial improvement, with a typical load lasting just under 45 seconds. Halo Infinite sees a similar speedup. 27.8 seconds is a reasonable load here on the One X with an SSD, though still well short of the Series S. In general, it seems that upgrading to an external SSD should roughly cut loading times in half relative to the stock hard drive in recent titles, while the Series S will halve that loading time again, or better if a game is properly optimized for the series console's SSDs. But there are some exceptions. Enter the Ascent, which has been lampooned for its rather outrageous loading times on last-gen hardware. Our hard drive load takes over 2 minutes here, but our loads on One X with SSD and Series S both clock in at about 30 seconds apiece. There's essentially no difference in loads between the two SSD-equipped consoles, suggesting that the Series S may not be properly utilized here. In these titles, we aren't seeing a seamless experience on our SSD-equipped One X, but I'd argue that Series S doesn't offer that either, outside of the small handful of titles that make full use of direct storage to dramatically shrink load times. The improvement in loads does seem like a very welcome enhancement, however, and the SSD upgrade seems well worth it for users still stuck on last-gen Xbox consoles. But that's not the only advantage that the SSD confers. In this test, we're taking an identical cruise through Night City and Cyberpunk 2077, with the game installed on the internal hard drive and the external SSD as well. There's somewhat less loading related pop-in on the SSD run here. Just look at this bit of ground detail. It resolves perfectly as we drive over it on the SSD run, but is still a bit of a blocky placeholder on the hard drive run. Most titles are carefully constrained to avoid these sorts of issues, so for the most part an SSD won't confer an in-game visual advantage. Still, some games will noticeably benefit, particularly demanding titles with heavy streaming needs. There is one category of games that we still need to talk about though, and it's a big one. Xbox Series S has backwards compatibility with original Xbox, Xbox 360, and Xbox One games, including games that long ago received their last updates. This is by far the lion's share of the games available to play on the current gen Xboxes. So how does the One X stack up against the Series S in some of these older games? First up is Final Fantasy XIII. This is a great looking PS3 and Xbox 360 game that was released under backwards compatibility in late 2018 and notably bore the Xbox One X Enhanced branding when it arrived. That means the game goes from a resolution of 1024 by 576 on the 360 all the way to 3072 by 1728 on Xbox One X, backed up by 2 times MSAA. There's a tripling of resolution on each axis, using the Xiii method for increasing resolution in games running under emulation. The Series S supports the Xiii method, but it doesn't offer the same res as One X. We only get a doubling of resolution on each axis instead, for a final resolution of 2048 by 1152. It doesn't look nearly as pristine as the clean-looking output on One X. There's far more visible aliasing in fine detail in these scenes, for instance, as well as in Lightning's hair. It's a nice upgrade over original hardware, but it isn't nearly as impressive as the playback on One X or Series X. Next up is Mirror's Edge. The same split in resolution is visible here, with the original game's 720p image increased to 1440p on Series S and a full 4K on One X. There is a twist, however. Mirror's Edge was recently updated with Microsoft's FPS boost technique, meaning that the framerate target is increased when running on Xbox Series consoles. Series S now targets 60 FPS, up from the 30 FPS target in the original game and on the One X. It's not perfectly successful, there are some dips here unfortunately, even in the game's opening sections. We do remain north of 50 FPS here though, and I think the increase in fluidity is worth a bit of additional stutter at times, considering the somewhat twitchy nature of DICE's first-person platformer. VRR can clear this all up of course as well. So it's a bit of a mixed result. One X Enhanced 360 games and all original Xbox games will see higher resolutions on One X, but the cohort of FPS boosted 360 games will run much smoother on Series S. This includes titles like Fallout 3, Elder Scrolls Oblivion, and Dead Space 2. In addition, Auto HDR improves the mapping of SDR images to HDR displays on Series consoles, and some last-gen games may also see loading benefits, courtesy of Microsoft's new CPU and storage architectures. Let's take a quick look at some Xbox One games as well. After the release of the Xbox One X in late 2017, most new games received enhancements on the new console. These typically amounted to large resolution boosts, and were sometimes paired with some settings tweaks as well. These improvements are available on One X as well as Series X, but are completely absent on Series S. Doom 2016, for instance, runs at a dynamic 4K on One X, but is limited to 1080p on Series S. The image on Series S is substantially blurrier as a result, with a somewhat smudgy output on fine detail. Red Dead Redemption 2 showcases an even more stark visual divide. Here the One X renders a full 4K, while Series S is limited to just 864p. The difference in clarity is absolutely massive here. Series S is far blurrier and less detailed than One X. This is an important consideration, as most titles released between late 2017 and mid-2020 have Xbox One X enhancements, but don't have Xbox Series versions. This includes major titles like Wolfenstein 2, Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, and Hitman 2, among many others. For now, these games are shackled to original Xbox settings on Series S, while they enjoy a much more detailed output on One X and Series X. FPS boost does come into play here as well, however. Some Xbox One titles see framerate enhancements on Microsoft's new machine. Far Cry 4, for instance, gets a boost to 60 FPS on Series S without losing any visual fidelity relative to One X, although One X never received a unique enhancement for this game. Some One X enhanced games, like Prey, have FPS boost features on Series S as well, which makes for a split between a high-resolution version on One X and a high framerate version on Series S. On the whole, One X is surprisingly competitive with Series S when equipped with an SSD. There are some wins and some losses in recent titles, but overall the systems are fairly close. An SSD upgrade makes for a large improvement in loading times as well, which makes the system less annoying to use when hopping between games. The One X really shines with less recent titles, however. Older One X enhanced games look so much better on One X than Series S, and titles that were released on the original Xbox or Xbox 360 often exhibit much higher resolutions on the One X. FPS boost is an interesting feature here, however, and does offer better response times and increased fluidity on the Series S in supported games. But that's not the whole story here. While we haven't seen many current-gen exclusives on Xbox, we have seen a few. Microsoft Flight Simulator is a stunning, extremely detailed game that transforms satellite data into a convincing visual approximation of commercial flight. And The Matrix Awakens is an unbelievably high-fidelity glimpse into the future of real-time rendering. Neither game looks as amazing on Series S as they do on Series X, of course, but they do run on Series S, and they're still visually impressive. These are titles that will never see a version on any last-gen console, including Xbox One X. Now, why is that? Well, let's take The Matrix Awakens as an example. The Matrix is an absolutely state-of-the-art demo that makes heavy use of ray tracing for lumen-based global illumination, RT reflections, and RT shadows, in addition to the nanite virtualized geometry system for highly detailed models without LOD popping. Some of these features might be possible on One X. A lower fidelity version of Lumen can be implemented through software ray tracing, for instance, and nanite should be possible on Microsoft's older machine as well. Other ray tracing features may be achievable as well, albeit with a massive framerate penalty. However, without the hardware-accelerated ray tracing available in the new consoles, performance wouldn't be good enough to achieve the fidelity on offer on Series S. Plus, an SSD would be required. The One X is still a capable machine that can produce some impressive results. Without a proper current-gen hardware feature set, however, it's going to hit a dead end in upcoming games. Ultimately, the Series X is the true Xbox One X successor. It offers an across-the-board increase in GPU performance, alongside all the current-gen enhancements common to both series consoles. It offers a no-compromise rendition of current games, and it will remain supported for many years to come. While the Series S offers up some very interesting comparisons, it's a machine built for a very different audience, where resolution and super high-end rendering features don't matter as much. So here's my final verdict. At present, I'd say the Xbox One X is at least competitive with the Series S in recent titles, particularly when running games off solid-state storage. Older titles often favor One X as well, with Series S simply not capable of running the One X visual enhancements. High frame rates on the One X are difficult to achieve, however, owing to the CPU limitations common to last-gen systems. Most Series S games do turn in reasonable 60 FPS modes, which is something the One X is simply incapable of doing. As the generation moves on, however, One X will inevitably be left behind. It remains to be seen exactly how well Series S will hold up in games several years from now, but it's virtually a guarantee that One X will be unsupported in major releases by then. The One X is only as successful as it is because of the extended cross-gen period we're currently in. The end of cross-gen will mean the end of Xbox One X support. So the One X and SSD combo that we put together here offers a reasonable rendition of modern games, for now. But the clock is ticking on Microsoft's 4-year-old console. But with that, we've reached the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for notifications for new videos. To view a high-quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch, just use Twitter. That's all for me for now. Thanks for watching.